Hello everyone, I'm Michael, and today, I'm going to tell you a story. What's the worst coworker you've ever worked with? Story 1. Hired a cook on a good recommendation. He was just fine the first 2 weeks. Then I noticed food going missing. Then supplies started going missing. Then a customer told me that he had been adding auto 30% tips his food purchases. When I looked at the books, I saw that he had been adding 30% tips to all the credit card sales. And the cash rings were off from what should have been sold. I fired him that day. The next day, he came in and apologized. Said he was on drugs and was going to rehab. I wished him well. Then next day, he tried to break in after close and was cut. Story 2. He just wouldn't work. Just wouldn't. This was in a research lab. He was a visiting researcher from another country, and he spent a lot of time asking tons of non-work related questions, to the point of disrupting others' work. In the course of a year, he designed one very basic experiment and didn't actually do it. Just designed it. He was above doing bench work apparently. He picked fights with everyone doing any experiment related to the one he was planning because he didn't want to have to share credit for anyone. He wouldn't clean up after himself, wouldn't pick up things from the floor. He actually called me in from another room because he wouldn't take a stringless tea bag out of his mug. Also on a different occasion, because he'd knocked some things off a hanger on the back of the door and for whatever reason wouldn't pick them up. It was kind of like working with a child. He must had servants where he lived. I don't know how, but he was there for his PhD. Boss fired him. He was one of 2 people in her 30-plus year career that she'd ever fired. Story 3. I worked with a guy who'd interrupt any conversation to talk about anything as if he was the expert. And I don't use anything as a hyperbole. He truly had something to say about anything, including things he had never heard of or obviously didn't know much about. When the subject being discussed was something in the category of things he didn't know much about, he would slowly steer the conversation away from the original discussion to something he would like to talk about at the moment. It was both amazing and the most annoying thing I had ever had to deal with. He was like that Wikipedia game where you start with Star Wars and somehow end up on LGBTQ+ struggles. Not to mention the conversation was basically 98% of him just talking nonstop. Everybody else was way too polite and against conflict to say anything, including me, so most people just tried to stay away from him. But he'd follow people around. I eventually left. But I even remember having a nightmare where he was the best man at my wedding. Story 4. This is about 15 years ago, but the office I worked in instituted a scent-free policy. One woman, who was already insufferable, was so offended by it that she snuck in her perfume collection. She'd walk down the halls and spray perfume into empty offices or cubicles when no one was looking or before everyone arrived in the morning. This went on for well over a month or 2. And we had no idea who was responsible. My coworkers and I started referring to this mysterious person as the Chanel Bandit. She was finally caught on camera in the act. She'd left for 3 weeks vacation and was unaware that we had installed cameras after a break-in. Some of us already suspected her, as the Chanel Bandit mysteriously stopped spraying while she was away. She quit right after she was cut. None of us were sad to see that cedar-scented psycho leave. Story 5. My worst coworker was one I worked with when I was a cashier at Walmart. She approached me and asked me to cash out her paycheck. I was still new at the job and never got training on how to do that function. She was sympathetic, so she walked me through how to do it. Transaction over and done. I go on about my day. I get called back a couple of days later by my managers and they circled me in an office and accused me of stealing. After tears, videotapes, and telling them what happened, they told me that apparently this coworker of mine had stolen not only from me, but several other people that day as well. They just wanted to confirm I wasn't in on the deal. Story 6. My coworker likes to initiate conversations, then does long pauses, where you go to say something back, then he cuts you off and keeps talking. He has entire conversations almost entirely by himself. He also likes to make changes to my paperwork before it's turned in, ends up riddled with spelling mistakes, while he tries to make the content look smarter. Fortunately, it's all electronically stamped with who made revisions. Story 7. He would walk in every day like it was his first day with no memory of anything we showed him the previous day. He was only focused for the first 30 minutes, then the rest of the time would be on his phone and try to work with one hand, which is bad because I work in a restaurant. Can't cook with one hand, but that didn't stop him from trying. Then one day, he just stopped showing up for like a week, then was confused when he came back and was fired. Edit. I'm not sure if he had memory issues or anything like that. At least he didn't tell us or the owner. He did, however, like to talk about how easy our job was because he'd had 4 other restaurant jobs before this one. He was only 19, but we didn't make him do anything complicated. But he would forget easy things like where we kept burger buns or where buttons were on the register. Also, he always left trash laying around after he was done with a job. It would be me and my other coworkers who cleaned up after him, and his excuse was always that he didn't think it mattered because it was gonna get cleaned up eventually. He still comes in every once in a while to watch our TV, sometimes with friends, and sometimes by himself. He never buys anything, but he just does it quietly so no one bothers him. Story 8. No contest. It was the literal crackhead I worked with for 4 months that was also secretly living in the office and being completely nonsensical when he was actually working. We found a mattress folded up in the warehouse after he was let go in an actual, brand new crack pipe with a price tag on it, to boot, squirreled away back there. He and his family, not just him living in the office, left discarded food everywhere like pizza crusts, in the toilet brush holder in the bathroom, what even, and they left hair in the sink in the bathroom as they were obviously bathing in there, too, as we had no actual bathing facilities in the office. One day during his tenure, he sent an email saying his alarm didn't go off and he'd be in at X time, which kept getting moved back later and later. He eventually showed up at 4:40 p.m., and we closed at 5 p.m. lol. See comment above about secretly living in the office. There's so much more I could go into. It was a wild 4 months, that's for sure. Edit. This blew up in a way I did not anticipate, and I've gotten a few responses that I'm making this up, but let me tell you, I really wish that I were. His girlfriend was always around at work, and she would move in a way that you would absolutely never see her face. We thought maybe she had a warrant out for her arrest or something. I think only one of us saw her actual face, and she would also sit behind the warehouse bay door in their Nissan Altima, with it running all day for the AC when she wasn't back there with him. He wanted us to hire her to help him, which wasn't happening. Our warehouse area was concrete flooring which didn't get cleaned often at all, and she'd walk around back there barefoot. As mentioned before, he was completely nonsensical at work as well. He suggested to my coworker, who scans our old documents to PDF via a feeder on our copier, of course, that she should take a picture of each page with her cell phone and do it that way. I got multiple emails from him that made no sense at all, and I eventually had to just forward some to my boss so he could see what was going on. It was a sad situation, but also a WTF situation for the rest of us. He brought his to the interview and asked if she could sit in on it because it was so hot outside. Now, if we didn't have a Walmart and a huge shopping center within spitting distance, that might have made sense, but that was pretty unprofessional, and they still hired him. All we did was lose money by employing him. He worked on one pro bono job we did and managed to fuck that up. This was at an engineering firm, by the way. Story 9. When I was an intern, there was this old shrew who would call people into her office. My cube shared a thin wall, gossip, then call those people in to tell them what was said, etc. She would try to frame people for shit she did wrong. She was so arrogant. And she refused to adapt to workforce modernization. Example, she refused to learn how to hyperlink in emails, documents, etc. A real ray of sunshine she was. Story 10. I worked at a grocery store, and one of the scheduling ladies was a total C-bomb. When you work at a grocery store, you expect to have shifts all over the place. That's part of the job, so I'm not complaining about that. Just about 2 years into working there, I had an accident and broke my thumb hand. Not while at work, unfortunately lol, and needed surgery. I went to apply for employment insurance. Yeah, and they required a record of employment, RO. So I asked the woman in charge of that, the aforementioned scheduling lady, if she would mind sending that off so I could still pay rent while I was off work recovering, but she told me she already had. So I go back to the offices, and they told me they still had no RO, so I go back to my old work and ask her a second time. This happens until I asked her to do it 4 times. This resulted in me having to borrow money from my parents for Christmas in order to pay my rent. Story 11. Back when I worked at a restaurant, I was friends with the bartender. Chill dude, right up. Until they made him manager, and that small amount of power and increase in pressure made him so angry all the time. He screamed at me that I was shit at my job because I didn't do a thing that I've never been asked to do before. He made me miss my last bus so I couldn't get home. It was pitch black outside and I cried on the bench outside the restaurant. Worst working day and worst coworker. It took me a long time to get over that and realize I wasn't a shit worker. He was just stressed and didn't know how to handle it, I suppose. Story 12. I've worked a lot of factories, but one I worked at was mainly for felons. The pay you complete shit and work you so hard it tears you body and mind up. I just graduated high school and it was my second factory, so I didn't know any better. One guy I work with, we nicknamed Big Matt since we already had another Matt. Well, Big Matt was a big fan of crystal and steroids, so the dude was absolutely jacked. But this 35-year still lived with his mom. He said it had to do with him being a kid and walking and her being raped, and ever since then he never wanted to leave her alone. At the time I thought, wow, that would explain the substance abuse. He just wants to be strong to protect her. Well, I was a fucking idiot. 2 months later, Big Matt and 2 coworkers didn't show up, so I asked the supervisor what happened, but he didn't know either. Next day, one of the coworkers came in and told us that all 3 had been arrested because after buying an O of weed, Big Matt's mom called the cops on them. So, before the cops showed up, Big Matt, a 6-foot-some-odd-inch buff meth, had beat his mother within an inch of life for calling the cops on him. Next day, I looked him up, and sure enough he was booked in a local prison. Suppose that has to be the worst coworker out of all the ones I faced. Story 13. There was this lady I worked with that just had the nastiest attitude. Normally, I can get along with most folks, but this person just brought the whole room down with negative vibes. Nothing was ever good, and she always had bad shifts. One thing she did that upset a lot of people was take patients down for x-rays and leave them down there to return to our office. The big thing to remember here is that even the lengthiest x-rays take maybe 10 minutes at the very most, to 5 minutes on average for the scans. Every morning, we got x-rays to do, and I had to send her back down to return patients to their rooms after the x-ray technicians called right as she got back to our office. The instances of leaving patients were common, so I informed my boss several times in person and email. Apparently, she had an attitude with every other department we worked with and never informed nurses that we were moving their patients. Big no-no when meds and vital signs need to be done. One day, she had abandoned a patient in the ER waiting room when they were waiting for a ride home, and told no one, so security had found a patient just sitting alone for 15 to 30 minutes without supervision. It took this and a year of recorded evidence for this person to finally get fired. When that happened, it's like a dark cloud lifted and a lot of people were relieved. Oh, and she tried to get various employees around the facility to sign a form to argue against her case. One person signed. Story 14. One of my favorite things about being in the military was that your pre-military status did not matter. Everyone wears the same uniform, and you'd never know if your favorite military leader came from privilege or squalor. The uniform, for all of its drawbacks, is an objectively effective unifier. It levels the playing field. Looking the same as everyone else challenged me to ensure that my work ethic and ideas created opportunities, not some predetermined status. I had a peer who was better than all of that. He didn't do the work unless it interested him. We didn't do interesting things, and constantly complained that our work was below him. On more than one occasion, he tried to pay for others to do his work for him. His entire point of being in the military was to prove to his father that he could earn something, and sought to accomplish that by claiming he'd already earned it. Story 15. His name was Dan. Dan was 37, working at a dead-end job as a lab specimen processor in a windowless room for 9 hours a day. He ate only Burger King, but without the lettuce because that's rabbit food. He drank literally a gallon of Mountain Dew a day, and was confused as to why people were horrified by that. There's water in it, he would say. Apparently, if he ate corn, he would vomit and have to go to the hospital. He would tell me he firmly believed that man and dinosaur roamed the earth at the same time, along with many other theories that came from his gut. One day, we got into a political argument before the 2016 election where he said if Bernie Sanders is elected president, there will be a civil war, and I will not hesitate to kill you and your family. Dan was fired. I got out of there as soon as I could. Don't be like Dan. Story 16. I worked in a certain touring exhibition last summer. It's not Potter, FY, and of 200 people who were applying for jobs, 20 of us got the job. We were all close, knit, and had a love for the exhibit content, and being all genuinely interesting people made us a family. Bar one woman. She thought she was the world's biggest star for having a 3-second cameo on GOT, and sent harassing messages and calls to many of us. She sexually harassed a lovely guy on the shop team who had no interest, undermined the bosses constantly, talked back, was rude to customers. When she thought we talked about her behind her back, she got defensive and spiteful. We didn't. One day she got knocked back for goodbye. The shop guy, and for some reason decided to take it out on me. Started slabbering about me around to every other coworker, but never to my face. She called me a white snake. Now, I am albino, and my hair color got me seriously bullied in school along the vein of her insults. So her name-calling was very hurtful. I had enough and took it to HR, and she was fired for her actions. I could go on, but she doesn't deserve any more thought. Story 17. At my first job, vet assistant at a small animal clinic, there was this middle-aged woman. She primarily worked as the receptionist, who was constantly snarky and rude towards me and my work. After sharing with another coworker that I was planning to go to school to become a vet, she, the receptionist, laughed at me and said, "I don't think I could see you as a vet." I was only 16 years old, mind you. I had big dreams and goals, and I was taking solid steps towards achieving them. I remember standing there, taken aback, and honestly holding back tears or any indication that I was upset. I was accepted to vet school at age 18, and I am still in school actively pursuing that dream. Guess, I'm gonna prove her wrong. Story 18. I worked in childcare, and they had hired a new assistant trainee teacher for my room. Each room has 2 teachers. She just constantly argued about the dumbest shit, and always tried to argue with me about both company and state childcare policies because that's dumb. Also was late every day her first week there. It all just started adding up until I was changing diapers and she was holding a 2-year-old child on her lap. I see a child biting another child and say, "You need to go help them," as I have a child in the middle of a very explosive, poopy diaper change up on the changing table and can't leave him there obviously. She doesn't get up. I repeat it, and she says, "Well, I have this kid on my laps, so I say take him off your lap." She responds, "He's strong like this grown-ass adult is unable to move a 2-year-old off her lap because of some weird super strength." Then the child bites the other child again, and at that point, I'm mad and tell her to get up and help them now. She then proceeds to say, "So what? I have to watch these 4 kids while you just have one up on the table, like I'm somehow supposed to have multiple children on the table at once to make her job of sitting on the floor making sure kids don't get bit twice in a row easier. And our ratios were 4:1 anyways." I finished my diaper change, stuck my head out the door to my supervisor, and told her get this lady out of my room. And they did after and wrote her up after reviewing the footage of the incident. She was fired for no call no showing the next week. I've worked with a lot of idiots in childcare, but she was so shitty in such a short amount of time. Story 19. It's my time to shine. Sorry it's long. About 2 years ago, I started work as a receptionist in an audiology clinic. So we do hearing aids and hearing tests. The only thing I knew about hearing aids before I took this job was that my grandpa had one. 8 months after I started, so at this point, I have 8 months of experience with anything related to hearing. They hired a new provider, who I would later discover knew nothing about anything. Not hearing aids, not basic, you should know this if you've had a job ever, not how to handle talking to bosses, patients, people over the phone, etc. Example, we had one patient who left her hearing aids with us to be fixed. She would call every once in a while to check on them, and I would say, "I'll ask the provider to call you and update you," which I did. 4 months later the same patient calls and I discover the provider had been ignoring me every time I told her to call the patient, and she just straight up didn't call her ever. Another example, she could never, ever remember to clock in and out. Ever. It was a daily struggle with her. She would have to send in time card adjustments like every day and then complain to me when our boss was annoyed. She didn't know to fill out repair forms, so every time we had to send something out, I would have to double check and make sure everything was filled out correctly, legibly. Again, she is the provider, who is credentialed in this field, and I'm the receptionist who has 8 months experience with hearing aids. She wouldn't do chart notes for weeks. Literally, she would have patient charts stacked in the corner of her office for days, forget to make chart notes, put in the incorrect dates, spell the patient's name wrong, so I would have to double check every chart before putting it back on the shelves. If she didn't know what to do with a patient, which was common, she would just do nothing. So I would have to pick up all of that slack, deal with the patients, take their complaints, talk to manufacturers over the phone. There were even times where I had to recommend hearing aids to patients because she just wouldn't. She would constantly forget to have patients sign paperwork. I would put a post-it on the chart, patient must sign. I would tell her beforehand, and yet she would still let them leave without signing purchase agreements and medical waivers. She could not keep track of the time. She would be going 10 to 30 minutes over appointment times, and I would have to deal with the pissed-off patient. I would tell her, hey, time warning, and she'd say okay, and then ignore me. She would keep elderly patients in for her new patient appointments for like 2 or more hours, usually an hour and a half appointment. Sometimes patients would have to tell her they needed to leave because they were tired or their feet hurt. These people are in their 80s. And the best, everything that went wrong was my fault. She would blame me for her poor job performance, her inability to retain patients and sell hearing aids, everything. After 6 months of this, I finally spoke up. I hadn't said anything up to this point because she was a really nice person apart from work, and I felt bad for her. But everyone has their limits. And also our company was starting to zero in on her because she wasn't making them any money. She was put on daily Zoom meetings with our boss and trainers. When this happened, they finally realized why she was making almost zero money. She was super incompetent obs, and they fired her. They told her they were shutting down the clinic altogether, but instead, they hired a new provider with loads more education, experience, someone who is confident and young and knows how an iPhone works. The only thing I got from this experience was a 30-cent raise at the end of the year and a major increases in my anxiety med dosage. Also, I guess I learned a lot about my job lol. Also, the new provider and I are BFFs, so my job is much more enjoyable. Much more enjoyable.